September 1940. The night sky over London erupted in flames as German incendiary bombs rained down on the ancient capital. On the roof of a medieval great hall, a middle-aged man stood watch, his silhouette stark against the orange glow of distant fires. Stephen Courtauld, millionaire industrialist and art collector, had traded his luxurious Art Deco drawing room for the dangerous duty of fire watcher. As white-hot fragments struck the 15th century roof beneath his feet, he fought desperately to save the hammerbeam ceiling that had witnessed 5 centuries of English history. The bombs found their mark. The great hall that had hosted Byzantine emperors and the young prince who would become Henry VIII suffered catastrophic damage. But this was merely the latest chapter in an extraordinary tale of survival, a story that began 6 centuries earlier, when a bishop gave a palace to a king, setting in motion a saga of royal splendour, tragic abandonment, and unlikely resurrection. This is the story of Eltham Palace, a building that refused to die, a medieval royal residence transformed into an Art Deco masterpiece, a home where a pet lemur scampered through rooms designed by Sweden's finest craftsmen, where ancient stone met chrome and glass, where 600 years of English history collided with the daring modernity of the 1930s. To understand how this impossible fusion came to exist, we must travel back to the early 14th century, to a moment when power, ambition, and strategic generosity converged in the hands of one of medieval England's most influential bishops. The year 1305 marked a turning point in English politics and architecture. Edward of Caernarfon, the future Edward II, stood at the threshold of kingship. His father, Edward I, the fearsome hammer of the Scots, still reigned, but the young prince already wielded considerable influence. It was in this year that Anthony Beck, the Prince Bishop of Durham, made a calculated gesture of loyalty that would echo through the centuries. Beck was no ordinary clergyman. As Prince Bishop, he ruled Durham like a sovereign prince, commanding his own army, minting his own coins, and wielding temporal power that rivaled many secular lords. His gift to the young Edward was equally princely. The manor of Eltham, a substantial estate in southeast London, positioned strategically between the city and the royal hunting grounds of Kent. Why would a bishop surrender such valuable property? The answer lay in the intricate dance of medieval politics. Beck needed royal favour. His bishopric bordered Scotland, and in the endless wars with the northern kingdom, Durham stood on the front lines. Royal support wasn't just desirable, it was essential for survival. The gift of Eltham was both tribute and investment, a down payment on future protection. Edward received it gladly. The location was perfect, close enough to London for quick access to the capital, yet surrounded by forests teeming with deer, boar, and other game. For a prince who would soon inherit a troubled kingdom, Eltham offered a peaceful retreat from the political storms brewing in Westminster. The property that Beck transferred was already substantial, though nothing like the palace it would become. There were manor buildings, agricultural lands, woodlands, and most importantly, extensive hunting parks. In medieval England, hunting wasn't merely sport. It was a statement of power, a demonstration of lordship over the land and its creatures. The ability to maintain vast enclosed parks where deer roamed freely, protected from common poachers by harsh forest laws, marked you as belonging to the highest echelons of society. When Edward II ascended to the throne in 1307, Eltham became crown property, beginning its 3-century tenure as a royal palace. But Edward II was not destined to be a great builder. His disastrous reign, marked by military defeats, baronial rebellion, and ultimately deposition and murder, left little time or resources for architectural ambition. The palace at Eltham during his reign remained modest, a functional manor rather than a statement of royal grandeur. It would take later monarchs to transform it into something magnificent. The true transformation of Eltham began in the 14th century under Edward III, one of medieval England's most successful warrior kings. Edward III reigned for 50 years, from 1327 to 1377, presiding over spectacular military victories in France and a golden age of English chivalry. It was Edward who founded the Order of the Garter, England's highest order of knighthood, an institution that survives to this day. And according to one historical account, The incident that inspired this foundation occurred at Eltham Palace. The story goes that during a ball at Eltham, the Countess of Salisbury, a lady of exceptional beauty whom Edward greatly admired, accidentally dropped her garter. As courtiers tittered at this intimate article lying exposed on the floor, Edward gallantly retrieved it and tied it around his own leg, declaring, "Honi soit qui mal y pense," shame upon him who thinks evil of it. Whether this charming tale is historical fact or romantic legend remains debated by scholars. What is certain is that Eltham became closely associated with the romantic ideals of chivalry that Edward worked so hard to cultivate. But Edward's contribution to Eltham went beyond legendary anecdotes. He invested substantially in expanding and improving the palace buildings. Royal accounts from his reign show regular expenditures on construction, repairs and improvements. The palace began to acquire the infrastructure necessary for a major royal residence: kitchens capable of feeding hundreds, stables for the royal horses, a chapel for divine services, lodgings for courtiers and servants. Most significantly, Edward established or expanded the jousting tilt yard, a specialized arena for mounted combat that would play a crucial role in one of Eltham's most celebrated events. By the late 14th century, Eltham had become the favourite palace of Henry IV, the first king of the Lancastrian dynasty. Henry had seized the throne in 1399, deposing his cousin Richard II in a coup that would have bloody consequences decades later. But in the early years of his reign, Henry sought to establish legitimacy through displays of royal magnificence and hospitality. He got his chance in December 1400 when an extraordinary guest arrived in England, Manuel II, Palaiologos, Emperor of Byzantium. This visit was unprecedented. Never before had a Byzantine emperor set foot on English soil, and never again would one do so. Manuel's presence in England was a measure of his desperation. The Byzantine Empire, once master of the Mediterranean world, had shrunk to little more than the city of Constantinople itself, besieged by the expanding Ottoman Turkish Empire. Manuel embarked on a tour of Western European courts, begging for military aid to save his beleaguered capital. His journey took him to Paris, to the Holy Roman Empire, and to England, where Henry IV received him with all the honour due an emperor whose lineage stretched back to Constantine the Great and Caesar Augustus himself. Manuel spent from December 1400 to mid-February 1401 at Eltham Palace. Imagine the scene: a monarch whose empire once ruled from Mesopotamia to Gibraltar, whose court spoke Greek while preserving Roman traditions, now a guest in a palace on the edge of Western Europe. The cultural exchange must have been remarkable. Byzantine robes and Orthodox ritual met English court customs and Catholic liturgy. Scholars conversed in Latin, the lingua franca of educated Europeans. And to honour his imperial guest, Henry IV organised a spectacular tournament at Eltham. The 1401 Eltham tournament was no ordinary joust. It was a carefully choreographed display of chivalric prowess designed to impress the Byzantine emperor and demonstrate English martial vigour. The format was elaborate: 13 combatants, each represented in literary form by a letter purportedly written by a legendary patron. These letters, composed in Old French, the language of chivalry and courtly culture, praised each knight's virtues and predicted his victory. 2 participants can be identified with certainty through their heraldry: William Bardolph, 5th Baron Bardolph, and John Clinton, a notable knight. The letters were probably read aloud during the tournament itself, adding a layer of literary performance to the physical spectacle of armed combat. The tournament took place in Eltham's Tilt Yard, which still exists today. Picture the scene: wooden barriers running down the centre of a long field, separating the charging knights to prevent collisions, stands erected for spectators, hung with colourful banners displaying the heraldic arms of participants. The thunder of hooves as armoured men on massive war horses crashed together, lances splintering against shields. The roar of the crowd as a knight was unhorsed, the anxious murmurs when someone was injured, and presiding over it all, in a place of honour, the Byzantine emperor, a living link to ancient Rome, witnessing a very different martial tradition from those of his own empire's past. This tournament was commemorated in a collection of 13 letters addressed to Henry IV's daughter, Blanche of England. Each letter praised one of the combatants and invoked a legendary patron, figures from Arthurian romance, classical mythology, and medieval legend. This literary dimension transformed the tournament from mere sport into a complex cultural performance, blending physical prowess with poetic sophistication. It reflected the late medieval fascination with chivalric romance, the same cultural moment that produced Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and inspired endless retellings of the Arthurian legends. For Manuel Palaiologos, the tournament must have been both impressive and alien. Byzantine military culture had evolved very differently from Western European chivalry. The Byzantines fought as professional soldiers in organized units, relying on discipline and tactical sophistication rather than individual heroism. The spectacle of armored knights charging at each other for honor and display would have seemed both magnificent and strange. Yet Manuel understood the symbolic importance of such ceremonies. He responded with appropriate gratitude and admiration, cementing the diplomatic bonds between England and Byzantium, bonds that would ultimately prove insufficient to save Constantinople when the Ottomans finally breached its walls in 1453. While Eltham served various monarchs well throughout the 15th century, its greatest architectural monument came during the reign of Edward IV, the first king of the House of York. Edward IV reigned in two periods, 1461 to 1470 and 1471 or 1483, separated by a brief restoration of his Lancastrian rival, Henry VI. It was during his second reign, in the 1470s, that Edward commissioned the construction of Eltham's Great Hall, the magnificent structure that survives today as the palace's medieval core. The Great Hall was completed around 1475-1479, though exact dates remain uncertain. What is certain is that Edward IV spared no expense in creating a hall worthy of a king who had seized the throne by force and needed to establish his dynasty's legitimacy through displays of wealth and power. The hall represented more than mere function. It was a statement carved in stone and timber, announcing that the House of York had arrived and intended to stay. The dimensions of the Great Hall were impressive by any standard. The interior measures approximately 100 feet in length and 36 feet in width, with walls rising to accommodate a ceiling height of around 55 feet at its peak. But the hall's true glory lay not in its size, but in its roof, a hammerbeam roof of extraordinary sophistication and beauty. Hammerbeam roofs represent one of the supreme achievements of medieval English carpentry. The design, which emerged in the 14th century, allowed builders to span wide spaces without the need for intrusive supporting columns that would obstruct the hall's interior. The principle was ingenious. Horizontal beams project from the walls, supported by curved braces. These hammer beams carry vertical posts that support further beams higher up, which in turn carry the roof's weight. The resulting structure distributes loads in a complex interplay of compression and tension, creating both structural stability and visual magnificence. Eltham's hammerbeam roof ranks as the third largest of its type in England, surpassed only by Westminster Hall in London and the Great Hall at Hampton Court Palace. The roof spans the full width of the hall without any supporting pillars, creating an unobstructed space that could accommodate hundreds of people for feasts, ceremonies, and court gatherings. Each hammerbeam terminates in a carved wooden angel, their wings spread in perpetual flight. These angels once held shields displaying heraldic devices, announcing the king's lineage and alliances to all who entered. The construction of such a roof required extraordinary skill. Master carpenters selected massive oak beams, seasoned for years to prevent warping and cracking. Each piece had to be precisely shaped to fit its designated position in the complex three-dimensional puzzle. The joints, mortise and tenon, dovetails, pegged connections had to be cut with exacting precision, for the entire structure's integrity depended on these wooden joints holding fast under enormous loads. Once assembled on the ground to verify fit, the roof was disassembled, hoisted piece by piece to the tops of the walls, and reassembled in place, a feat of engineering and coordination that boggles the modern mind. The Great Hall's walls were constructed of red brick, a material that was becoming increasingly popular in 15th century England. Brick had several advantages over stone. It was cheaper, could be produced locally, and allowed for more rapid construction. Yet brick also carried prestige, particularly when used for royal buildings. The warm red colour of the walls contrasted beautifully with the creamy white of the limestone details, window surrounds, doorways, and decorative elements. The hall's south wall featured a series of large perpendicular Gothic windows, their tall, narrow lights divided by stone mullions and filled with glass. Glass windows were still a luxury in the 15th century, and their presence in such abundance announced the building's royal status. Sunlight streaming through these windows would have illuminated the hall with constantly shifting patterns of light and shadow, bringing the space to life. At the east end of the hall, raised above the main floor, stood the dais, a platform where the king and his most honoured guests would sit during feasts. From this elevated position, the monarch could survey the entire hall, literally looking down upon his courtiers and visitors. At the opposite, west end of the hall were the service doors leading to the kitchens, pantries and buttery. Between these doors and the main hall floor would have stood a wooden screen, creating a passage where servants could move between the service areas and the hall without disrupting the proceedings. The roof space above the hammer beams was open to view, allowing everyone in the hall to appreciate the magnificent carpentry. In the flickering light of torches and candles, the only illumination available in the 15th century, the carved angels would have seemed to move, their shadows dancing across the timber beams. During great feasts, with hundreds of people crowded into the hall, the air filled with the smell of roasting meat, spiced wine and wood smoke, the noise of conversation and music echoing off the high ceiling, Eltham's great hall must have been overwhelming to the senses. In the late 15th and early 16th centuries, Eltham Palace served as one of the primary residences for the royal children of Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty. It was here that a young prince named Henry, the second son, never expected to inherit the throne, spent much of his childhood and early education. This boy would become Henry VIII, one of England's most famous and controversial monarchs. But in 1499, he was simply a precocious 8-year-old prince, receiving his education alongside his siblings at Eltham. The year 1499 brought an encounter that Henry would remember for the rest of his life. Thomas More, the brilliant lawyer and humanist scholar who would later serve as Henry's Lord Chancellor before being executed for refusing to accept the king's break with Rome, came to visit the palace. More brought with him a distinguished guest, Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam, the greatest scholar of the age, whose writings would help spark the Reformation that Henry would exploit for his own purposes decades later. Erasmus later recorded this visit in his correspondence, providing us with a vivid snapshot of life at Eltham Palace and of the young prince who impressed him so deeply. Erasmus wrote, "I'd been carried off by Thomas More, who had come to pay me a visit on an estate of Mountjoy's, where I was staying, to take a walk by way of diversion as far as the nearest town. For there all the royal children were being educated, Arthur alone excepted, the eldest son. When we came to the hall, all the retinue was assembled, not only that of the palace, but Mountjoy's as well. In the midst stood Henry, aged 9, already with certain royal demeanour. I mean a dignity of mind combined with a remarkable courtesy." The scene Erasmus describes reveals much about Eltham's function in this period. The palace served as a dedicated residence and educational establishment for the younger royal children. Arthur, the Prince of Wales and heir to the throne, was being educated separately, already learning the specific skills and knowledge required of a future king, but his younger siblings, Henry, Margaret and Mary, lived at Eltham under the supervision of tutors and guardians, learning languages, music, theology, and all the accomplishments expected of Tudor royalty. The Great Hall served as the setting for this encounter. Imagine the 9-year-old prince standing in the centre of that magnificent space, surrounded by courtiers and retainers. Even at this young age, Henry displayed the charisma and commanding presence that would characterise his kingship. A dignity of mind combined with a remarkable courtesy, these qualities, observed by one of Europe's most perceptive intellectuals, foreshadowed the young prince's future. But young Henry caught Erasmus off guard. During dinner, the prince sent the scholar a note, requesting something from his pen, essentially a poem or literary composition in Henry's honour. Erasmus, who had expected a simple courtesy visit, found himself unexpectedly obligated to produce a work worthy of a royal prince. He confessed to being slightly indignant with More for having given me no warning, but the challenge was irresistible. Returning home, Erasmus set to work, and within 3 days had completed a poem for Prince Henry, despite complaining that the muses, from whom I had lived apart so long, were unwilling. This anecdote reveals the sophisticated cultural environment at Eltham. A 9-year-old prince not only recognized Europe's greatest living scholar, but had the confidence and learning to request an original composition from him. The expectation that Erasmus would comply, and the scholar's ultimate willingness to do so despite his initial annoyance, demonstrates the weight of royal favour and the intertwining of learning and power in Tudor England. The educational programme at Eltham aimed to produce not just rulers but Renaissance princes, individuals versed in classical languages, familiar with ancient authors, capable of appreciating music and poetry, skilled in theological disputation. Henry VIII would grow up to be all these things, and more. He wrote music, including the famous song Pastime with Good Company. He engaged in theological debate with Martin Luther and composed a treatise against the Reformer that earned him the papal title Defender of the Faith, a title English monarchs still bear, ironically even after Henry broke with Rome. The foundations for these accomplishments were laid during his childhood at Eltham Palace. Throughout the Tudor period, Eltham Palace served as one of the favourite venues for royal Christmas celebrations. The medieval Christmas season was far longer than our modern version. It ran from Christmas Eve through Epiphany on January 6th, encompassing 12 days of feasting, entertainment and religious observation. The royal court's Christmas celebrations were opportunities for the monarch to display generosity and magnificence while reinforcing social hierarchies through elaborate ceremonial. The Great Hall was perfect for these celebrations. Its vast space could accommodate hundreds of guests, from the highest nobility to minor courtiers and foreign dignitaries. Trestle tables would be set up running the length of the hall, laden with an astonishing variety of dishes. A royal Christmas feast might include roasted swans, peacocks served in their feathers, venison from the palace's own deer parks, boars' heads garnished with herbs and fruits, elaborate pastries shaped like castles or ships, and subtleties, sculptural centerpieces made from marzipan, sugar, and other delicacies. Entertainment accompanied the feasting. Musicians played from the minstrel's gallery, providing a soundtrack of carols, dances, and courtly songs. Troupes of actors performed interludes, short comedic or moral plays that often included satirical commentary on contemporary events. Acrobats, jugglers, and other performers moved through the crowd. The Lord of Misrule, a servant or minor courtier chosen to preside over the Christmas festivities as a mock king, orchestrated games and entertainments that inverted normal social hierarchies, allowing servants to give playful orders to their masters and creating a brief period of sanctioned disorder. The contrast between the religious solemnity of Christmas and the secular exuberance of the celebrations sometimes troubled clerical reformers, but the royal court saw no contradiction. The Christmas season celebrated Christ's incarnation, yes, but also God's generosity in giving his Son to humanity, a generosity the king imitated by distributing gifts, hosting feasts, and providing entertainment for his subjects. The theological and the festive intertwined seamlessly in the medieval worldview. Eltham's location, reached easily from Greenwich Palace by a short ride through the royal parks, made it especially convenient for these extended celebrations. The court could shift between palaces, holding some festivities at Greenwich and others at Eltham, keeping the celebrations fresh and avoiding the sanitation problems that inevitably arose when hundreds of people remained in one place for extended periods. Despite its glories, Eltham's time as a primary royal residence was drawing to a close by the mid-16th century. The death of Henry VIII in 1547 marked a turning point. His daughter Elizabeth I, who reigned from 1558 to 1603, preferred other palaces, particularly Greenwich, which had been massively expanded and modernised during her father's reign. Greenwich offered easier access by river, the Thames serving as Tudor London's primary highway, and boasted more modern amenities and more extensive buildings. Eltham didn't disappear from royal use immediately. Its hunting parks remained valuable assets, offering excellent sport within easy reach of London. Elizabeth visited occasionally, and the palace was maintained at royal expense, but it was no longer the vibrant centre of court life it had been under the early Tudors. Rooms stood empty for months at a time. The Great Hall, which had echoed with the sounds of royal feasts and Christmas revels, now stood silent except for the occasional hunt-gathering or administrative meeting. The situation worsened under the Stuart monarchs. James I, who became King of England in 1603, showed little interest in Eltham, though he did appoint keepers for the various parks. One such keeper was Roger Aston, a Scottish courtier who served as keeper of the little park at Eltham in 1610. Aston made improvements to the estate, including constructing 4 bridges for the king's convenience when hunting, but these were utilitarian modifications rather than architectural enhancements. By the 1630s, the palace was essentially abandoned as a royal residence. In a poignant echo of its past cultural significance, Charles I granted the use of some rooms at Eltham to Sir Anthony van Dyck, the brilliant Flemish painter who served as the king's principal court artist. Van Dyck used these rooms as a country retreat, a place to escape the intensity of London and the demands of the court. One imagines the artist working in rooms once occupied by princes, his canvases capturing the doomed Stuart court in its final years of splendour before the cataclysm of civil war. That cataclysm arrived in 1642, when England descended into civil war between King Charles III and Parliament. The conflict, which lasted until 1651, devastated much of England's heritage. Eltham suffered catastrophically. Parliamentary forces, who controlled southeast England for most of the war, saw little use for a royal palace. Worse, the extensive parks offered valuable resources: timber for construction and fuel, deer for meat. Parliamentary commanders systematically stripped the parks, felling ancient trees and slaughtering the deer that had roamed there for centuries. The palace buildings themselves fell into ruin through a combination of neglect, vandalism, and systematic stripping. Lead was removed from roofs to be melted down for bullets. Window glass was taken. Anything of value that could be carried away disappeared. The diarist John Evelyn, who visited Eltham on April 22, 1656, recorded the desolation. Went to see His Majesty's house at Eltham, both the palace and chapel in miserable ruins, the noble wood and park destroyed by Rich the rebel. The rebel Evelyn referred to was Colonel Nathaniel Rich, a parliamentary officer who had overseen the destruction of Eltham's parks. For Evelyn, a staunch royalist, who deplored the execution of Charles V and the abolition of the monarchy. This vandalism represented more than mere property damage. It symbolised the destruction of England's ancient order, the overthrow of traditions stretching back centuries. His bitter phrase, "the noble wood and park destroyed," mourns not just trees and deer, but an entire way of life. The Great Hall survived, but barely. Its hammerbeam roof, stripped of lead covering, was exposed to the elements. Rain poured in, rotting the oak beams. The walls, no longer maintained, began to crumble. The magnificent windows lost their glass, becoming mere openings through which wind and weather invaded. The dais at the east end, where kings had sat, was obscured by debris and decay. When Charles II returned from exile to reclaim his throne in 1660, he faced enormous financial challenges. The Civil War and interregnum had bankrupted the crown. Charles needed to reward loyal supporters, pay off creditors, and re-establish the monarchy's finances. Restoring abandoned palaces like Eltham ranked low on his priority list. Instead, he gave the ruined estate to John Shaw, presumably a supporter who had aided the royalist cause during the dark years of exile and civil war. The Shaw family and their descendants held Eltham from 1660 until at least 1893, a period of more than 2 centuries. During this time, the estate existed in a curious limbo. It was no longer a royal palace, yet the Great Hall, too massive to demolish, too expensive to maintain, remained standing, a gradually decaying monument to vanished glory. The Shaws made use of what they could. The former buttery, one of the service buildings, was converted into a residence called Court House. The 15th century bridge across the moat remained passable. Fragments of walls from other buildings stood scattered around the grounds, slowly being reclaimed by vegetation. For more than 250 years, Eltham Palace existed in this state of romantic decay. The Great Hall became a favourite subject for artists and antiquarians. J.M.W. Turner, the great English landscape painter, visited around 1793 and produced a watercolour showing the hall's interior in ruins, the roof open to the sky, vegetation growing from the walls, but the magnificent hammerbeam structure still visible. Turner's painting captures the melancholy beauty of these ruins, which epitomised the 18th century aesthetic fascination with picturesque decay and the transience of human glory. Victorians, with their passion for medieval history and Gothic revival, took renewed interest in Eltham. Antiquarians documented what remained. Historians researched the palace's past, uncovering its associations with Edward IV, Henry VIII, and the great events of English history. But documentation didn't mean restoration. The industrial Victorian age, focused on progress and modernity, saw little value in actually restoring medieval buildings. Ruins were aesthetically pleasing, precisely because they were ruins, cautionary reminders of mortality and the passing of ages. The early 20th century brought new threats. Urban expansion pushed ever closer to Eltham. What had once been a rural estate southeast of London was becoming increasingly suburban. Developers eyed the land hungrily. The Great Hall, structurally unsound after centuries of neglect, faced potential demolition. Several proposals emerged for the site: housing developments, industrial uses, complete clearance. The hall's survival hung by a thread. Then, in 1933, something remarkable happened. A wealthy industrialist with a passion for history and architecture discovered Eltham Palace and saw not a ruin to be demolished, but an opportunity for one of the most daring architectural projects of the 20th century. Stephen Courtauld was born into one of England's great industrial families. The Courtaulds had built their fortune on textile manufacturing, particularly the production of rayon, an artificial silk that revolutionized the fabric industry in the early 20th century. By the 1930s, the Courtauld family name was synonymous with wealth, culture, and philanthropy. Stephen's older brother Samuel had founded the Courtauld Institute of Art, one of the world's premier institutions for art history education, and amassed an extraordinary collection of impressionist paintings that would eventually be given to the nation. Stephen shared his brother's cultural interests but expressed them differently. While Samuel collected old masters and impressionists, Stephen was fascinated by architecture, both ancient and modern. And in Virginia Perano, the woman he married, he found a partner who shared these passions. Virginia, known to friends and family as Jeannie, came from an Italian-American family and brought her own aesthetic sensibilities to the marriage. Together, the Courtaulds represented the cosmopolitan elite of interwar Britain, wealthy, cultured, progressive in their tastes, unafraid to challenge conventions. When the Courtaulds learned that the Eltham Palace site was available on a 99-year lease, they saw an opportunity that excited them both. Here was a genuine medieval royal palace, or at least its most important surviving building, combined with extensive grounds perfect for creating the kind of gardens they loved. The location, while no longer rural, was still surrounded by parkland and offered relative privacy, despite being within easy reach of central London. Most importantly, the site offered a unique architectural challenge: how to combine a medieval Great Hall with a thoroughly modern home. The Courtaulds had no interest in creating a fake medieval palace. They weren't Victorian romantics who wanted to play at being medieval lords. They were thoroughly modern people who appreciated both historical architecture and contemporary design. Their vision was radical: preserve and restore the Great Hall to something approaching its 15th century glory, but attached to it a completely new house designed in the most modern style of the day, Art Deco. To realize this vision, they hired the architectural firm of Seeley and Paget, two architects who had established a reputation for sensitive restoration work combined with bold modern design. John Seeley and Paul Paget understood what the Courtaulds wanted: not pastiche, not imitation, but genuine restoration of the old combined with uncompromising modernity for the new. Work began in 1933 and would continue for approximately 3 years. The project proceeded on 2 parallel tracks: restoration of the medieval Great Hall and construction of the new Art Deco house. the Great Hall presented enormous challenges. More than 250 years of neglect had taken their toll. The hammerbeam roof, exposed to weather since the Civil War, had suffered extensive damage. Oak beams, though remarkably durable, had rotted in places where water had penetrated. The carved angels at the ends of the hammer beams were badly eroded. The walls had lost much of their original surface. The floor was covered in debris and detritus accumulated over centuries. Seeley and Paget approached the restoration with scholarly care. They documented every surviving element, researching how the hall would have appeared in the 15th century. Where original features survived, they were carefully conserved. Where elements were too damaged to save, they were replaced with new work that matched the original as closely as possible, using traditional materials and techniques. Modern engineering was employed invisibly to stabilize the structure. Steel reinforcements hidden within walls, new foundations where necessary, but always subordinated to the historical fabric. The roof received particular attention. Structural engineers assessed each beam, determining what could be saved and what required replacement. Skilled carpenters working with traditional tools and techniques repaired damaged sections and replaced those beyond saving. The roof was covered with new lead, protecting it from weather for the first time in 3 centuries. The carved angels were conserved or replaced as needed, though their heraldic shields, long since lost, were not recreated. Seeley and Paget made some additions to the hall, but these were carefully considered and reversible. They added a minstrel's gallery at the west end, above the service doors, a feature common in medieval great halls but not definitively known to have existed in the original Eltham. They also installed a timber screen separating the service passage from the main hall floor, again a typical medieval feature. These additions enhanced the hall's historical character and practical usability while remaining clearly identifiable as 20th century work for anyone who looked closely. The floor received new paving in a style appropriate to the hall's period. The windows, empty for centuries, received new glass. Not the coloured glass that might have filled them originally, but clear glass that allowed light to flood the interior while protecting it from weather. Electric lighting was installed, but discreetly, using fixtures designed to be as unobtrusive as possible. While this painstaking restoration proceeded, construction of the new house advanced rapidly. The site chosen was immediately adjacent to the Great Hall, creating a physical connection between medieval and modern. The new house was built around a courtyard, a layout that referenced Tudor palace design, while serving thoroughly modern functions. The architectural style Seeley and Paget developed for the new house drew inspiration from Christopher Wren's work at Hampton Court Palace and Trinity College, Cambridge. This was a shrewd choice. Wren, England's greatest classical architect, had worked at Hampton Court in the 1690s, creating additions that harmonised with the Tudor palace while expressing the new classical aesthetic of the late 17th century. Seeley and Paget saw themselves doing something similar, creating new work that respected the historical setting while expressing the aesthetic of their own time. The exterior of the new house was relatively restrained. Red brick, the same material used for the Great Hall, formed the primary fabric, creating visual continuity with the medieval building, but the detailing was unmistakably 20th century. Clean lines, simplified classical elements, large windows that let in abundant light. The overall effect was dignified and harmonious, neither aggressively modern nor apologetically historical. It was inside the new house that the court hall's true vision became apparent. Here, freed from the constraints of historical restoration, they created an Art Deco masterpiece. Art Deco emerged in the 1920s and flourished in the 1930s as the dominant style for luxury design. The name comes from the 1925 Exposition Internationale des Arts Décoratifs et Industriels Modernes held in Paris, which showcased this new aesthetic. Art Deco combined influences from various sources: the geometric abstractions of modern art, the streamlined forms of industrial design, exotic motifs from ancient Egypt and Mayan civilization, and luxurious materials associated with the Jazz Age. The Courtaulds embraced Art Deco enthusiastically, but with sophistication and restraint. They weren't interested in the flashy Hollywood glamour version of the style. Instead, they sought refined, elegant Art Deco that emphasized beautiful materials, expert craftsmanship, and harmonious proportions. To achieve this, they brought in the finest designers they could find from multiple countries, each contributing their particular expertise. The entrance hall set the tone for the entire house. This dramatic circular space was designed by Rolf Engströmer, a Swedish designer known for his sophisticated approach to modernist interiors. Light flooded down from a glazed dome overhead, a classical architectural feature reinterpreted in modern materials. The dome's geometric pattern of glass panels created constantly changing patterns of light as the sun moved across the sky. The walls were veneered in black bean, an Australian hardwood with a dark, lustrous finish and beautiful grain patterns. The wood was not applied in simple panels but as part of complex marquetry, pictures and patterns created from different coloured woods inlaid into a background. The marquetry depicted stylized figures in a manner influenced by Art Deco's fascination with simplified, geometric representations of the human form. The entrance hall's floor was equally remarkable, polished terrazzo incorporating marble chips in geometric patterns, a sweeping curved staircase, its balustrade made of aluminum, a metal that still carried connotations of luxury and modernity in the 1930s, led to the upper floors. The overall effect was breathtaking, a space that combined natural materials with modern industrial ones, traditional craftsmanship with contemporary aesthetics, creating something entirely new. From the entrance hall, visitors could access the various principal rooms of the house. Each room had its own character, but all shared a commitment to the highest standards of design and execution. The dining room was the work of Piero Malacrida de Saint-Auguste, an Italian designer who became one of the Courtaulds' primary collaborators for the interior. Malacrida specialized in creating spaces that combined rich materials with restraint and elegance. The dining room featured walls lined with figured maple veneer, its natural grain patterns providing subtle decoration. The furniture, dining table, chairs, sideboards, was custom designed to complement the room's architecture, all pieces sharing the same refined Art Deco aesthetic. Lighting was crucial to the dining room's effect. Wall sconces and a central ceiling fixture provided illumination, but these weren't merely functional. The fixtures themselves were sculptural objects, their forms echoing the geometric patterns that appeared throughout the house. When lit, they created layered effects of direct and indirect light that changed the room's mood dramatically from day to night. The drawing room, also designed by Malacrida, served as the house's principal reception space. Here the Courtaulds would entertain guests, hold conversations, listen to music, all the social functions of an upper-class English household. The room was larger than the dining room and more elaborately furnished. Silk wall coverings, custom carpets, upholstered furniture in Art Deco fabrics, every element was carefully chosen to create a harmonious whole. The drawing room's focal point was a magnificent fireplace with a surround of rare marble. The fireplace served both practical and symbolic functions. Practically, it provided warmth during England's cold months. Symbolically, it anchored the room, providing a centre around which furniture and conversation could arrange themselves, maintaining an ancient tradition while expressed in thoroughly modern materials and forms. Perhaps the most remarkable room in the entire house was Virginia Courtaulds' bedroom suite. This comprised a circular bedroom and an adjoining bathroom, both designed by Malacrida and representing Art Deco domestic design at its absolute peak. The circular bedroom was an architectural tour de force, creating a perfectly circular room within the rectilinear geometry of the house's structure required careful planning and expert execution, but the effort was worthwhile. The circular form created a space that felt both intimate and grand, cocooning, yet not claustrophobic. The room's walls were veneered in pale woods, probably sycamore or birch, creating a light, airy atmosphere. Built-in wardrobes followed the room's curve, their doors perfectly fitted to the circular wall. The bed, custom designed for the space, was positioned to take advantage of the room's geometry. Above, the ceiling continued the circular theme, with a raised dome echoing the entrance hall's glazed dome, but here created in solid materials with subtle decorative painting. The floor was carpeted in a custom-designed carpet that picked up the room's colour scheme and geometric themes. Furniture, dressing table, chairs, small tables, was all specially designed to complement the architecture. Even the room's hardware, door handles, light switches, window fittings, received the same level of design attention as the major architectural elements. The adjoining bathroom was equally extraordinary. Art Deco bathrooms represented the style's particular genius for combining luxury with hygiene, aesthetics with function. Virginia's bathroom featured walls lined with marble and decorative tiles in geometric patterns. The bathtub, a massive affair, was positioned to enjoy natural light from windows while maintaining privacy through the use of frosted glass. Chrome and nickel fixtures, taps, towel rails, shower fittings gleamed against the marble. These materials, products of modern industrial processes, were still relatively novel in domestic settings and carried connotations of cleanliness, modernity, and sophistication. The contrast between cool metallic surfaces and warm marble created visual interest and textural variety. The bathroom also featured extensive mirrors, another Art Deco hallmark. Mirrors served practical purposes, allowing one to check one's appearance from multiple angles, but also created visual effects, making the space seem larger and multiplying the reflections of light from the chrome fittings and marble surfaces. While Virginia's bedroom suite represented Art Deco's aesthetic peak, other rooms in the house served more specific functional needs while maintaining the same high design standards. The library was essential for the Courtaulds, both cultured people who read extensively and collected books. The room was lined floor to ceiling with custom-built bookcases in a rich wood, probably mahogany or walnut. A rolling ladder provided access to upper shelves. Comfortable chairs and reading lights created spaces for actual reading rather than mere display. The library's design balanced function with aesthetics. Yes, it needed to house thousands of books efficiently, but it also needed to be a pleasant space to spend time in, to read, to think, to have quiet conversations. The solution was a room that felt substantial and dignified without being oppressive, scholarly without being stuffy. Stephen Courtaulds' study was more personal. Here he could pursue his own interests, conduct business, write correspondence, and display objects of particular significance to him. The room featured a desk positioned to receive good natural light, comfortable seating, and storage for papers and documents. One object in the study held special meaning for Stephen, a statuette version of the Sentry, copied from a Manchester War Memorial designed by Charles Sergeant Jagger. Jagger had served in the Artists' Rifles during the First World War, as had Stephen Courtauld. The statuette served as a memorial to that shared experience and to the friends who had not returned from the trenches. Its presence in Stephen's study was a reminder that beneath the Art Deco glamour and the 1930s sophistication lay a generation that had survived the war and carried its memories forward. Among all the remarkable features of Eltham Palace under the Courtaulds, perhaps the most eccentric was their pet lemur, Mahjong. Ring-tailed lemurs are primates native to Madagascar, known for their distinctive black and white striped tails and large, expressive eyes. How the Courtaulds acquired Mahjong is not entirely clear, but exotic pet keeping was fashionable among the wealthy in the 1930s, and the Courtaulds had the resources to indulge such interests. Mahjong was not confined to a cage. He had the run of the house, climbing curtains, leaping from furniture to furniture, and generally behaving as lemurs do. To accommodate him, the Courtaulds designed a special room on the upper floor, fitted out with branches for climbing and other lemur-friendly features. But Mahjong's territory extended well beyond this room. A special hatch connected Mahjong's room to the flower room on the floor below, allowing him to move between levels. This architectural feature, a hatch designed specifically for a lemur's convenience, perfectly encapsulates the Courtaulds' approach to their home. Every detail mattered. Every inhabitant's needs, even the lemurs, received serious consideration. Imagine guests arriving for dinner, being escorted through the magnificent Art Deco entrance hall, and suddenly encountering a ring-tailed lemur scampering across the terrazzo floor. The juxtaposition of sophisticated modernist architecture and exotic wildlife must have been startling and delightful in equal measure. It certainly ensured that Eltham Palace under the Courtaulds was memorable. Mahjong's presence also reveals something about the Courtaulds' relationship to their remarkable home. They didn't treat it as a museum or a showcase. They lived in it fully with all the messiness and unpredictability that actual life entails. Yes, the design was exquisite. Yes, every detail had been carefully considered. But this was a home, a place where a pet lemur could have the run of the house if that's what his owners wanted. The Courtaulds were passionate gardeners, and the grounds at Eltham gave them ample opportunity to indulge this passion. The estate included approximately 19 acres, a substantial area for gardening even by the standards of wealthy landowners. The gardens they created blended formal and informal elements, combining structured garden rooms with more naturalistic planting. Near the house, formal gardens provided outdoor living spaces that extended the Art Deco aesthetic into the landscape. Geometric patterns in paving and planting beds echoed the house's interiors. A sunken rose garden, surrounded by stone balustrades and reached by steps, created a sheltered, intimate space for enjoying the summer blooms and their fragrance. Further from the house, the gardens became more informal. Winding paths led through planted areas designed to look natural rather than manicured. Trees, some inherited from the property's past, others newly planted, provided structure and shade. The medieval moat, still present, was incorporated into the garden design, its water adding movement and sound to the landscape. The Courtaulds employed a head gardener and additional staff to maintain these extensive grounds. Creating and maintaining a garden on this scale required not just money but knowledge, skill and constant labour. Seeds had to be sown, plants propagated, lawns mowed, hedges trimmed, weeds controlled, pests managed. The gardens represented a significant ongoing investment, but for the Courtaulds, this investment was worthwhile. The gardens weren't just decoration, they were an essential part of how they wanted to live. From the completion of the house in 1936 until their departure in 1944, the Courtaulds lived at Eltham Palace, creating a unique social world that blended aristocratic tradition with modern sensibilities. They entertained frequently, hosting dinner parties, garden parties, and weekend house parties. Guests would arrive to find themselves in a space unlike any other in England, a medieval great hall connected to cutting-edge Art Deco interiors, surrounded by beautiful gardens, with a lemur potentially scampering past at any moment. The Courtauld social circle included artists, writers, intellectuals, and wealthy industrialists. These were people who appreciated what the Courtaulds had created at Eltham, who could discourse knowledgeably about architecture and design, who shared the Courtaulds' cultural interests. Dinner conversation might range from the latest developments in modern art to political developments in Europe, from gardening techniques to literary criticism. The house itself facilitated this sophisticated entertaining. The dining room could accommodate substantial dinner parties. The drawing room provided space for after-dinner conversation, perhaps with music from the piano. In fine weather, the gardens offered additional entertainment possibilities: croquet on the lawn, tea in the rose garden, evening strolls as the sun set. But life at Eltham was not all social whirl and cultural sophistication. The Courtaulds maintained a substantial household staff: butler, housekeeper, cooks, maids, footmen, chauffeur, gardeners, and more. Managing this staff was a significant responsibility, falling primarily to Virginia Courtauld. The smooth running of the household, the successful execution of dinner parties and weekend gatherings depended on the staff's skill and dedication, overseen by their employers. The outbreak of the Second World War in September 1939 transformed life at Eltham Palace. The comfortable, cultured world the Courtaulds had created suddenly faced existential threat. London became a target for German bombers, and Eltham, positioned in southeast London along the approach path to the capital, was particularly vulnerable. Stephen Courtauld, though in his 50s, wanted to contribute to the war effort. He joined the local Civil Defence Service, the organisation responsible for dealing with air raids and their aftermath. This meant fire watching, spending nights on roofs and high buildings, watching for incendiary bombs and raising the alarm when they fell. On a night in September 1940, during the height of the Blitz, Stephen was on duty as a fire watcher on the roof of the Great Hall when German bombers struck. The aircraft dropped incendiary bombs, small explosive devices designed to start fires rather than destroy buildings through blast. Multiple incendiaries struck the Great Hall's roof. Stephen and his fellow firewatchers fought desperately to prevent catastrophe. Incendiary bombs burned with intense heat, hot enough to ignite wood and thatch. The Great Hall's hammerbeam roof, though covered with lead, was vulnerable. If the bombs penetrated the lead and reached the ancient oak timbers beneath, the entire roof could be consumed in flames. Despite their efforts, the damage was severe. The bombs burned through the lead in multiple places, scorching the timber beneath. Parts of the roof structure were damaged, though the fundamental integrity of the hammerbeam construction held. Still, the roof required extensive repairs that couldn't be undertaken during wartime, when resources and labour were desperately needed for more pressing purposes. The bombing marked a turning point for the Courtaulds. They continued living at Eltham for a few more years, but the house was no longer the peaceful retreat it had been. Air raid sirens became a regular feature of life. Blackout regulations meant covering all windows at night to prevent light escaping and guiding German bombers. Rationing limited food and other supplies. Staff members left for military service or war work. The gardens, deprived of sufficient labour, became overgrown. In 1944, the Courtaulds made the painful decision to leave Eltham. Stephen's health was declining, and the constant stress of wartime London was taking its toll. They initially moved to Scotland, seeking peace and safety away from the bombing. Eventually they would settle in southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, beginning a new chapter of their lives far from England. Before departing, the Courtaulds needed to find a use for their remarkable house. Leaving it empty would be irresponsible during wartime, when housing and facility space was desperately needed. In March 1945, they gave Eltham Palace to the Royal Army Educational Corps, the military organisation responsible for educating soldiers in everything from basic literacy to advanced technical skills. The Royal Army Educational Corps initially used Eltham Palace for administrative purposes, but in 1948 they moved their entire headquarters operation to the site. For nearly half a century, the palace that had hosted medieval kings provided childhood homes for Tudor princes and served as an Art Deco showcase became a military facility. The military occupation was a mixed blessing for the building. On the positive side, it ensured the palace was maintained and occupied rather than left to decay as it had been for 250 years after the Civil War. The army kept the roofs watertight, the heating systems functioning, the grounds at least minimally maintained. Without this occupation, Eltham might have deteriorated badly during the difficult post-war years, when Britain struggled with economic recovery and had little money for heritage preservation. On the negative side, military use meant adapting the building to purposes it was never designed for. The Great Hall became a lecture hall and ceremonial space for military events. The Art Deco interiors were used as offices, sleeping quarters, storage areas, and classrooms. Beautiful wood veneers were damaged by screws and nails, holding up notice boards and filing cabinets. Delicate marquetry was scuffed by military boots. The gardens, though maintained, were simplified and reduced in scope. The army did make some positive contributions. They repaired the bomb damage to the Great Hall roof, restoring the lead covering and stabilizing the structure. They maintained the heating systems, preventing the kind of freeze-thaw damage that destroys buildings left unheated in winter. They kept the buildings weather-tight and structurally sound. But military occupation also meant that Eltham Palace was effectively closed to public access. Few people outside the army knew about this extraordinary building. The Courtaulds' Art Deco masterpiece, one of the finest examples of 1930s domestic architecture in Britain, remained largely unknown even to architectural historians and heritage enthusiasts. This situation persisted until 1992, when the Educational and Training Services branch of the Adjutant General's Corps, successor to the Royal Army Educational Corps, relocated to Worthy Down Camp in Hampshire. After 47 years, the military's occupation of Eltham Palace ended. The departure of the military in 1992 left Eltham Palace's future uncertain. The building was owned by the Crown Estate, the organisation that manages properties belonging to the British monarch. The Crown Estate had to decide what to do with this unusual property, a medieval Great Hall attached to an Art Deco house, all surrounded by historic gardens. The solution came in 1995, when English Heritage, the government organisation responsible for managing and promoting England's historic buildings, assumed management of the entire Eltham Palace site. English Heritage had already managed the Great Hall since 1984, when responsibility for that building was transferred separately. Now they controlled the whole property and could develop a comprehensive plan for its future. English Heritage recognised that Eltham Palace offered something unique. It wasn't just a medieval building or just an Art Deco building, but both together, embodying 7 centuries of architectural history. The combination of Edward IV's Great Hall and the Courtaulds' 1930s house told a story about the continuity and change in English architecture and society that no single period building could match. But realising this potential required extensive restoration. Nearly 50 years of military use had left its mark. The Art Deco interiors needed careful conservation. Original paint schemes and materials had to be identified through research and analysis. Where original features had been lost or damaged, difficult decisions had to be made about whether and how to recreate them. English Heritage launched a major restoration project in the mid-1990s. The work proceeded methodically, room by room, consulting historical records, interviewing people who had known the Courtaulds, examining physical evidence in the building itself. Paint analysis revealed original colour schemes. Photographs from the 1930s showed how rooms had been furnished and decorated. Bills and correspondence from the original construction provided details about materials and suppliers. The entrance hall's restoration was particularly challenging. Engstromer's marquetry had suffered damage, and some pieces were missing. Restorers had to match the original Australian black bean wood and recreate the marquetry patterns. The glazed dome had to be repaired, and its geometric patterns of glass carefully maintained. The aluminum balustrade of the staircase required conservation to prevent further deterioration. Virginia Courtaulds' circular bedroom and bathroom presented similar challenges. Original fixtures had to be conserved or replicated. The custom-designed furniture had been dispersed after the Courtaulds left, so English Heritage had to either locate the original pieces or commission accurate reproductions based on photographs and surviving examples. The gardens required equally extensive work. By the 1990s, much of the Courtaulds' original planting had been lost. English Heritage's garden historians researched what the gardens had looked like in the 1930s, consulting photographs, garden plans, and plant lists. They then set about recreating the gardens, replanting beds, restoring paths and structures, bringing the moat and its surroundings back to something approaching the Courtaulds' vision. The restoration was completed in 1999, and Eltham Palace opened to the public as a visitor attraction. For the first time in decades, people could walk through the Great Hall, marvel at the hammerbeam roof, then proceed into the Art Deco house and experience the extraordinary interiors the Courtaulds had created. Today, Eltham Palace stands as one of England's most unusual and fascinating historic sites. It attracts visitors interested in medieval history, Art Deco design, garden history, and the broader story of how England's heritage has been preserved and adapted over centuries. The Great Hall impresses all who enter it. Standing in that space, looking up at the hammerbeam roof with its carved angels, one can imagine the scene in 1401, when Manuel Palaiologos watched jousting in the nearby tilt yard, or in 1499, when the young Prince Henry met Erasmus. The hall embodies medieval England's architectural achievement and the lost world of royal pageantry. But step through the connecting passage into the Courtaulds' house, and you're transported to the 1930s. The Art Deco interiors, fully restored, showcase the era's aesthetics at their finest. The entrance hall's black bean marquetry and glazed dome, Virginia's circular bedroom with its custom furniture, the dining room's elegant maple veneer, each room demonstrates what could be achieved when wealth, taste, and access to the finest designers converged. The juxtaposition of medieval and modern is what makes Eltham Palace unique. Most historic houses in England fall into one category or another. You visit a medieval castle or a Georgian mansion or a Victorian country house. But at Eltham, you experience both medieval grandeur and Art Deco sophistication in a single visit. This combination tells a complex story about English attitudes toward history and modernity, about how each generation reinterprets and adapts what it inherits from the past. The gardens, restored to their 1930s appearance, provide another layer of interest. Walking through the formal garden rooms near the house, then into the more naturalistic areas beyond, visitors can appreciate the Courtaulds' vision of how landscape should relate to architecture. The medieval moat, now purely decorative rather than defensive, connects past and present in the landscape, just as the buildings do architecturally. English heritage has taken care to present Eltham Palace in ways that respect both its medieval past and its Art Deco reinvention. Interpretive materials explain the building's complex history. Rooms are presented as they would have appeared in the 1930s, with careful reconstructions of the Courtaulds' furnishings and decorations. The Great Hall is explained in its medieval context, with information about Edward IV, Henry VIII, and the building's construction. The site also hosts events and exhibitions that bring different aspects of its history to life. Medieval reenactment groups sometimes perform in the Great Hall. Art Deco weekends celebrate the 1930s with period music, fashion shows, and lectures on the era's design. Garden enthusiasts come for talks on period garden design and planting. The story of Eltham Palace is ultimately a story about survival through adaptation. The building has survived for more than 5 centuries because it has repeatedly found new uses and new patrons willing to invest in its preservation. When the medieval royal palace was abandoned in the 17th century, conventional wisdom would have predicted its complete disappearance. Indeed, everything except the Great Hall did disappear. But the Great Hall survived, first through romantic neglect, allowed to decay into picturesque ruins, and then through the Courtaulds' radical reimagining of what it could become. The Courtaulds could have demolished the ruins and built their modern house from scratch. That would have been simpler and cheaper. Instead, they chose to incorporate the medieval hall into their new home, creating something unprecedented. This decision saved the Great Hall and gave it new life as part of a 20th century dwelling. Similarly, the military's occupation from 1945 to 1992, though hard on the Art Deco interiors, ensured the buildings remained maintained and occupied during decades when many country houses were demolished or fell into ruin. The army's presence, however architecturally inappropriate, was preferable to abandonment. Finally, English heritage's restoration and opening to the public in the 1990s gave Eltham Palace its current identity as a heritage attraction. This latest transformation ensures the building's future, while making it accessible to thousands of visitors who might never have experienced it otherwise. Each transformation has been controversial in its time. When the Courtaulds built their Art Deco house attached to the medieval hall, some critics condemned it as vandalism, an inappropriate intrusion of modern design into a historic setting. Today, the Art Deco house is recognized as a masterpiece in its own right, and the combination of medieval and modern is seen as Eltham's unique strength rather than a compromise. The palace's history raises broader questions about heritage and preservation. Should historic buildings be frozen in time, preserved exactly as they were at some designated significant moment? Or should they be allowed to evolve, to acquire new layers of history, to serve new purposes? Eltham Palace argues powerfully for the latter approach. It demonstrates that buildings can embody multiple periods simultaneously, that the medieval and the modern can coexist respectfully, that preservation and adaptation are not incompatible. Stephen and Virginia Courtauld left Eltham in 1944 and never returned. Stephen's health continued to decline, and he died in 1967. Virginia outlived him by many years, dying in 1991 at the age of 98. Neither lived to see English heritage's restoration of their former home, though Virginia came close. What would they have thought of Eltham Palace as a public visitor attraction? We can only speculate. They had created it as a private home, a place to live their lives according to their own aesthetic and cultural values. But they were also generous people who gave substantial sums to cultural and charitable causes. The Courtauld Institute of Art, founded by Stephen's brother, Samuel, was based on a similar principle, that great art and beautiful objects should be accessible to students and scholars, not locked away in private collections. Perhaps they would have approved of Eltham's transformation into a public site. After all, their creation of the Art Deco house had itself transformed a near ruin into something magnificent. English heritage's work continued that tradition of transformation and revival, ensuring that future generations could experience what the Courtaulds had created. The Courtaulds' names are now inseparable from Eltham Palace. When visitors tour the house, they learn about Stephen and Virginia's tastes, their interests, their pet lemur, their lives together in this remarkable place. The building serves as their memorial more effectively than any statue or plaque could. Mahjong the lemur, who delighted visitors in the 1930s and scandalized some of the court hall's more conventional neighbors, is remembered too. His special room on the upper floor and the hatch to the flower room below are pointed out to every tour group. In a way, Mahjong has achieved a peculiar immortality, his antics preserved in the stories told about Eltham Palace, his name and memory associated forever with one of England's most unusual houses. The gardens the court halls created have been restored to something close to their original appearance. Visitors can walk the same paths Stephen and Virginia walked, enjoy the same views, perhaps sit in the same spots where they once sat on summer evenings, watching the sun set over the medieval moat and their astonishing house. Eltham Palace has witnessed 7 centuries of English history. Its walls, if they could speak, could tell of medieval monarchs and Byzantine emperors, of the young prince who became Henry VIII meeting the greatest scholar of the age, of royal Christmases when the great hall echoed with music and laughter, of Civil War devastation and centuries of neglect, of a visionary couple creating an Art Deco masterpiece, of bombs falling during the Blitz and military occupation in the post-war years, and finally of restoration and new life as a public heritage site. Each era left its mark. The medieval builders created the magnificent Great Hall with its hammerbeam roof. The Tudor monarchs used the palace for hunting and celebrations. The Civil War left it in ruins. The court halls gave it Art Deco interiors of exceptional quality. The military kept it maintained through difficult decades. English heritage restored it and opened it to all. The miracle is that all these layers still exist, still visible, still legible in the building's fabric. You can stand in the Great Hall and look up at the 15th century roof, then walk through a doorway into the 1930s and admire Rolf Engstromer's entrance hall. Medieval stone and Art Deco chrome coexist, separated by 5 centuries of history but united in a single building. This coexistence is Eltham Palace's great gift to us. It demonstrates that history is not a series of disconnected moments, but a continuous flow, each age building on or reacting against what came before. It shows that the past doesn't have to be either rigidly preserved or carelessly destroyed. It can be adapted, reinterpreted, given new meaning and new life. When you visit Eltham Palace today, you're not just visiting a medieval building or an Art Deco house. You're visiting a place where 7 centuries of English history converge, where every generation's contribution is valued and preserved, where the past and the modern meet and enhance each other rather than competing. In a world that often sees conservation and progress as opposing forces, Eltham Palace suggests a different way forward. It shows that we can honour what our ancestors created while adding our own contributions, that buildings can evolve without losing their essential character, that the medieval and the modern can not only coexist, but create something richer than either could alone. The Great Hall that Edward IV built in the 1470s still stands, its hammerbeam roof still magnificent after more than 500 years. The Art Deco house the court halls created in the 1930s shines with renewed lustre after English heritage's careful restoration. Together, they tell a story about resilience, adaptation, and the enduring power of great architecture to inspire and delight across the centuries. This is Eltham Palace, medieval royal residence, Art Deco masterpiece, and testament to the truth that the best way to preserve the past is not to freeze it in amber, but to give it new life for each generation.